Most people picture pharaonic Egypt as a backdrop of gold and grandeur, where slaves hauled stones and gods reigned in silence. The truth is something else entirely. What actually unfolded in that narrow valley along the Nile demanded enduring a system as brutal as it was sophisticated, one where every drop of sweat had an owner. This is the story you were never told. The Egypt of the 14th century, before the Common Era, was, without exaggeration, the greatest economic and military power the ancient world had yet produced. A territory stretching more than 1,100 kilometers along the Nile, from the cataracts in the south to the marshy delta in the north, sustained a population estimated between 3 and 4 million people, and at the heart of that empire, wedged between the eastern edge of the delta and the royal construction sites, lived a foreign community that already numbered around 600,000 souls, counting adult men alone, according to the record in Exodus chapter 12, verse 37. Count women, children, and the elderly, and that figure climbed to somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million people. Nearly an entire nation living inside another nation, and that inner nation was about to witness something no prior record in human history had ever documented. Before reaching the plagues, it is necessary to understand what it meant to wake up on an ordinary day in that Egypt. Because the plagues did not fall on an empty stage. They fell on a meticulously organized civilization where every person had a role, every resource had a destination, and every failure in the system propagated like a crack in a dam. Consider the mechanics of that society. Egypt did not operate with currency. The entire economy revolved around a system of redistribution, centralized in the pharaoh and the temples. The average Egyptian peasant cultivated a strip of land approximately 1.5 hectares wide along the floodable banks of the Nile. Each year, between June and September, the river rose between 6 and 8 meters, covering the entire alluvial plain with a layer of nutrient-rich sediment that transformed desert into arable land. It was the most important event on the calendar. All of life depended on that flood. And when it receded, the real work began. The peasant planted emmer wheat, barley, flax, and legumes. From the total harvest, the state kept roughly 20% as direct taxation. The temples took another 10 to 15%. What remained fed the family, when anything remained. Consider the situation of the Hebrews within that system. They were not peasants with their own land. They were forced labor, what the Egyptians called something approximating the term the records translate as servants of the state. Exodus chapter 1, verses 13 and 14, describes the condition in words that leave no room for softening. The Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor and made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. The Hebrew word used for rigor is perek, carrying the sense of brutality, of crushing through violence. This was not ordinary work. It was systematic destruction of the body. A mud brick in ancient Egypt weighed between 12 and 15 kilograms each. Records found at Deir el-Medina and at the construction sites of Pi Rameses indicate that a forced labor crew produced between 1,000 and 1,500 bricks per day. Each brick required collecting mud from the Nile, mixing it with cut straw, pressing it into wooden molds, and leaving it to dry in the sun for 4 to 6 days at temperatures exceeding 45 degrees Celsius in the Egyptian summer. The workers did this barefoot, submerged in mud to their knees under the watch of overseers armed with rods. Excavations at sites from the period have uncovered skeletons with severe arthritis in the knees and spine, stress fractures in the feet, and bone wear consistent with forced labor beginning in adolescence. Some of those bodies were under 30 years old. Months of uninterrupted labor. No weekly rest, as the Hebrews would later come to know. No seasonal breaks. The only variation was the type of destruction the body endured. Consider the food situation. The Hebrew worker received rations controlled by the state. Administrative papyri from the period, such as those found at Lahun, describe daily portions for manual laborers, approximately 10 barley loaves and 2 measures of weak beer. This was not beer as we know it today. It was a fermented paste diluted in water with low caloric value, serving more as a source of carbohydrates than as a drink. Protein came from dried Nile fish, offered perhaps 2 or 3 times per week. Meat was virtually absent from the workers' diet. Numbers chapter 11 verse 5 records the Hebrews themselves looking back with longing on the fish they ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. That longing reveals 2 things. The diet existed, but it was monotonous and insufficient for the level of exertion demanded. Chronic malnutrition exacted a silent price. Pregnant women working under those conditions faced infant mortality rates that paleodemographic studies estimate between 30 and 40% in the first 2 years of life. For every 10 children born in captivity, 3 or 4 did not survive, and that was before any extermination decree like the one described in Exodus chapter 1, verses 15 and 16, when the Pharaoh ordered the midwives to kill Hebrew boys at birth. Now scale against that suffering the Egypt that surrounded it. While the Hebrews were molding bricks in Goshen, a few dozen kilometers to the south, the city of Thebes displayed the largest religious complex in the ancient world. The Temple of Karnak covered an area of more than 100 hectares, the equivalent of 14 professional football fields placed side by side. Its main columns in the hypostyle hall stood 23 meters high, each so wide that 6 people joining hands could not have reached around its circumference. There were 134 of them. Every stone was cut, transported, and raised by human hands, many of them belonging to forced laborers. The pharaoh inhabited a parallel reality. The royal residence at Pyramesses, identified by archaeologists at the modern site of Kantir in the eastern delta, covered approximately 30 square kilometers. It was larger than many medieval European capitals. Within it stood palaces with floors of blue faience, stables for war horses imported from Anatolia, workshops manufacturing bronze weapons, and gardens irrigated by artificial canals. The pharaoh wore linen so fine it was practically transparent. 1 square meter of that cloth weighed less than 50 grams, lighter than modern silk. His table received cuts of beef, roasted goose, figs, dates, pomegranates, honey, and wine imported from Canaan. And less than 1,000 meters from those palaces, enslaved workers slept in barracks of dried mud. That was the Egypt when the plagues began. Not a generic backdrop of oppression, a living, complex, economically interdependent system where every gear affected every other. And that is precisely why the plagues were so devastating. They did not strike Egypt at random. They struck each pillar supporting that civilization, one by one, with surgical precision. The first plague turned the Nile to blood. Exodus chapter 7, verses 20 and 21. The river that was literally the god Hapi, the source of all life, all irrigation, all economy, became unusable. The fish died, the water became unfit for consumption. 7 full days without access to the primary water source of a country where the average temperature exceeds 35 degrees Celsius for 6 months of the year. The practical impact is more brutal than it first appears. An adult person requires at least 2 liters of drinking water per day in a temperate climate. In Egyptian heat, with manual labor, that number rises to 5 to 7 liters. Multiply that by 3 to 4 million Egyptians. That is roughly 15 to 28 million liters of drinking water needed per day. And the primary source had simply disappeared. The Egyptians dug wells around the Nile, as Exodus chapter 7, verse 24, records. But improvised wells in the alluvial soil of the delta produced cloudy, contaminated water. Children and the elderly would have been the first to suffer severe dehydration. Livestock depended on the Nile even more than humans. A working ox consumes between 40 and 60 liters of water per day. Egypt possessed vast herds. Records from the time of Rameses indicate thousands of head of cattle in the royal estates alone. Without clean water for 7 days, animal mortality would have begun even before the 5th plague struck the livestock directly. But the most brutal work had not yet begun. The 2nd plague brought frogs. Not a few frogs. An invasion that Exodus chapter 8, verse 3 describes entering the houses, the bedrooms, the beds, the ovens, and the kneading troughs. Examine the specifics of that description. In the ovens, in the kneading troughs. This means food production was directly compromised. Bread was the foundation of the Egyptian diet. Without functioning ovens, without uncontaminated dough, the food chain of millions of people took an immediate blow. When the frogs died, the biblical text says, they were gathered into heaps and the land reeked. Exodus chapter 8, verse 14. The decomposition of millions of dead amphibians under the Egyptian sun created a scene of biological contamination on an industrial scale. The stench was the least of the problems. The putrefaction drew insects and created disease hotspots in every village, every street, every house, and that prepared the ground for the 3rd plague, lice. The Hebrew word kinim may refer to lice, gnats, or other tiny insects that reproduce in decomposing organic matter. All that mass of dead frogs became a perfect breeding ground. The text says, the dust of the earth became lice throughout all the land of Egypt. Exodus chapter 8, verse 17. On man and on beast. An infestation that blanketed the entire country. Follow the deterioration. Each plague did not merely cause direct damage, it amplified the destruction of the one before. The contaminated water weakened bodies and killed fish. The death of the fish unbalanced the aquatic ecosystem. The frogs, with no functioning aquatic predators, proliferated uncontrollably before dying en masse. Their decomposition fueled the explosion of insects. This was an ecological cascade that any modern biologist would recognize as catastrophic. The 4th plague brought swarms. The Hebrew word arof is translated in different ways. Flies, mixed swarms of insects, or even wild animals in some traditions. Exodus chapter 8, verse 24 says the land was corrupted because of the swarms. Whatever the exact species, the result was the destruction of cultivable land and relentless physical torment. And here a detail appears that changes everything. Beginning with this 4th plague, the biblical text draws an explicit distinction. Exodus chapter 8, verse 22, and in that day I will set apart the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there. The separation between Egyptian suffering and the protection of the Hebrews becomes visible and geographic. This was not a matter of abstract faith. It was a line on the map. On one side, destruction. On the other, normalcy. And everyone could see it. Witness the moment the 5th plague strikes what was perhaps the most valuable asset after the Nile, livestock. Exodus chapter 9, verses 3 through 6. A very severe pestilence on horses, donkeys, camels, oxen, and sheep. The Egyptian cattle died, but of the cattle of the children of Israel, not one died. The economic weight of this is difficult to overstate. The ox in ancient Egypt was not merely food, it was agricultural traction, cargo transportation, a unit of exchange, and a religious offering. A single working ox held a value equivalent to several months' wages for a skilled craftsman. Horses were even more valuable, used exclusively by the military forces and the elite. Losing the herds meant losing the capacity to plow the land, to transport construction materials, to move the army, and to feed the temples with sacrifices. The economic engine of Egypt had its motor ripped out. No pharaoh had ever faced this. The sixth plague brought boils. Exodus chapter 9, verses 10 and 11, sores erupting on surviving humans and animals. The pharaoh's own magicians, who until then had been attempting to replicate the signs, could not even stand before Moses because of the boils. Picture the scene. The most powerful men in the Egyptian religious system, the priests who embodied the millennial wisdom of that civilization, unable to remain upright. The humiliation ran as deep as the physical pain. Boils under the sanitary conditions of the 14th century before the Common Era meant an extremely high risk of secondary infection. Without antibiotics, without antiseptics, with the water supply already compromised since the first plague and insects everywhere since the third and fourth, every open wound was a gateway to septicemia. Mortality among the elderly and children from infections arising from those boils would have been significant, though the text provides no specific numbers. And the Egyptian medical system, the most advanced in the ancient world, was overwhelmed. Medical papyri, such as the Ebers Papyrus, dated to approximately 1550 before the Common Era, show that Egyptian physicians knew more than 700 remedies and treated dozens of different conditions. But their treatments depended on ingredients sourced from the Nile, on plants cultivated in lands now devastated, and on animal fat from herds that no longer existed. The knowledge remained, the resources had vanished. Then came the seventh plague, and with it a meteorological violence that Egypt was simply not equipped to withstand. Hail. Exodus chapter 9, verse 18. Tomorrow about this time I will cause very heavy hail to rain down, such as has not been in Egypt since its founding until now. The claim is absolute. Nothing of that magnitude had occurred in all of Egypt's history up to that point. And Egypt's history already stretched back more than 1,500 years. The hail killed everything in the field, men, animals, herbs, and trees. Exodus chapter 9, verse 25. The flax and the barley were destroyed because the barley was in the ear and the flax was in bud. Exodus chapter 9, verse 31. These botanical details allow the plague to be dated with precision within the Egyptian agricultural calendar. Barley ears between January and February, and flax blooms in the same period. This means the destruction struck the crops at exactly the moment of their greatest vulnerability, nearest to harvest. Months of agricultural labor annihilated in a single storm. The wheat and the spelt survived because they were late crops. Exodus chapter 9, verse 32. That detail offered a false hope, because the eighth plague was already on its way. Locusts. Exodus chapter 10, verses 14 and 15. The text says they covered the face of the whole earth so that the land was darkened. They ate every herb of the land and all the fruit of the trees which the hail had left. Not one green thing remained, either on the trees or on the plants of the field, throughout all the land of Egypt. The biological scale of a locust swarm capable of darkening the sun is almost incomprehensible. Modern swarms of desert locusts in East Africa can contain up to 80 million individuals per square kilometer. An average swarm consumes in a single day the same quantity of food as 35,000 people. The swarm described in Exodus covered all the land, a cultivable area of approximately 25,000 square kilometers in the Nile Delta and Valley. The wheat and spelt that had survived the hail were completely consumed. Egypt was left without food reserves. See the scene through the eyes of someone living in that delta. The Nile had already been contaminated. The livestock had died. The fields had been devastated first by hail, then by locusts. Bodies were covered in boils. Insects infested every surface. The grain storehouses, those very granaries that Joseph had filled centuries before, the reserve system that was the pride of pharaonic administration, were being emptied with no possibility of replenishment. A nation that fed millions of mouths now looked upon storehouses with visible flaws, and the Pharaoh's own servants, the court advisors, begged. Exodus chapter 10, verse 7. They told the Pharaoh that Egypt was destroyed. The word used is unambiguous, destroyed, not threatened, not weakened, destroyed. And even then the Pharaoh held out. The ninth plague attacked something none of the others had touched, the collective psyche, darkness. Exodus chapter 10, verses 22 and 23. A thick darkness over all the land of Egypt for 3 days. No one could see another. No one rose from his place for 3 days. But all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. 3 days of total darkness. This was not a long night. The text specifies a darkness that could be felt, a blackness so dense it was nearly physical, in a civilization whose supreme deity was Ra, the sun god. This was more than discomfort. It was cosmological collapse. The sun did not rise. Egypt's principal god had been silenced, blinded, nullified. The psychological terror of 3 days without any light, unable to move, not knowing whether the next day would come, is something the modern mind, accustomed to switching on a lamp at any moment, can barely begin to measure. The temperature would also have dropped. The Egyptian desert has brutal thermal amplitude. During the day, it exceeds 40 degrees, but at night it can fall to 10 or 12. Without the sun for 3 days, temperatures would have settled at levels cold for a people without artificial heating. Children and the elderly, already weakened by hunger and disease, would have suffered mild hypothermia. And without light to find food, water, or care for the sick, suffering multiplied with every hour spent in the dark. Silence, and then came the 10th plague, the most devastating, the one that no human resource could foresee, prevent, or explain. Exodus chapter 12, verse 29. At midnight, the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of the Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of livestock, every house, without exception, from the royal palace to the deepest cell. The firstborn of every Egyptian family died in the same night. Exodus chapter 12, verse 30 completes the picture. Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. Calculate the magnitude of that grief. In a population of 3 to 4 million, assuming an average of 4 to 5 children per family, and recognizing that the firstborn was typically the eldest son, the number of dead in a single night may have reached between 500,000 and 700,000 people, a number equivalent to the entire population of a major modern city, erased between sunset and sunrise. And not anonymous deaths. These were the eldest sons, the heirs, the ones who carried the family name, the ones their fathers had watched grow up first. The Egyptian funerary system, the most elaborate in the ancient world, required 70 days for the complete mummification of a body. Approximately 370 kilograms of natron were required to desiccate a single adult corpse. Meters of linen were needed for the bandaging. Specific unguents, resins, and amulets were required. For hundreds of thousands of simultaneous dead, the system simply collapsed. The majority of those bodies did not receive the funerary rites that all of Egyptian theology considered essential for the afterlife. For an Egyptian, that meant something worse than death. It meant the eternal annihilation of the soul. And while Egypt mourned its dead, the Hebrews were doing something they had never done as a nation. Exodus chapter 12, verses 3 through 11 describes the preparation of the Passover lamb. Each family was to take a lamb without blemish, a male of the first year, on the 10th day of the month. Keep it until the 14th day. Slaughter it at twilight. Apply its blood to the 2 doorposts and the lintel. Roast the flesh over fire, not boiled in water, not raw. roasted over fire, with bitter herbs and unleavened bread, and eat standing dressed with sandals on their feet and staff in hand, in haste. Examine each detail of that meal. This was not a celebratory banquet. It was a war meal. The posture was that of people ready to leave at any second. The bitter herbs recalled the suffering of slavery. The unleavened bread marked the urgency. There was no time to wait for the dough to rise, and the blood on the door was the line between life and death. Inside that house, protection. Outside it, the destroyer. Then came the order to depart. Exodus chapter 12, verses 31 and 32. The Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, "Rise up, get out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you have said." The man who had resisted 9 plagues, who had hardened his heart before every sign, who had refused every appeal, broke. In the darkness of that night, holding perhaps the body of his own son, he sent the people away, and the Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the land, for they said, "We shall all be dead." Exodus chapter 12, verse 33. The very Egyptians who had enslaved the Hebrews for generations were now begging them to go, and they did not send them away empty-handed. The Hebrews asked the Egyptians for silver objects, gold objects, and clothing. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they granted what they asked. Exodus chapter 12, verses 35 and 36. It is the most complete reversal imaginable. The slaves left carrying the wealth of their masters. The oppressed departed wearing the clothes of their oppressors. Those who had nothing took everything, and those who had everything were left with corpses and empty fields. The Exodus began on the night of the 15th day of the month of Nisan. Around 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Exodus chapter 12, verse 37. A great mixed multitude also went up with them, Egyptians, Nubians, other foreigners who saw in those events the confirmation of something beyond any natural explanation. They drove before them immense flocks of sheep and herds of cattle. The column of people stretched for kilometers, a human river that took perhaps 2 or 3 days to fully empty the region of Goshen, and they carried in the mass of their bodies the marks of those centuries, shoulders deformed by the weight of bricks, feet calloused and cracked from hot mud, backs bent before their time, lungs compromised by the dust of construction sites, whip scars, memories of sons drowned in the Nile by royal decree. The price of that freedom was written into the flesh of every person who crossed that border. Behind them lay an Egypt that was unrecognizable. The river had been desecrated, the livestock had died, the fields were devastated, the storehouses were empty, the firstborn were dead. The army still existed, but its spirit was broken. The temples still stood, but their gods had been systematically humiliated. Each plague had struck a specific deity in the Egyptian pantheon. The bloodied Nile disgraced Hapi. The frogs mocked Heket, the frog-headed goddess who symbolized fertility. The pestilence among the animals defied Hathor, the cow-formed goddess. The darkness annihilated Ra, and the death of the firstborn defeated the Pharaoh himself. Considered the Son of God on earth, Egypt would take decades to recover. Some historians note that the period immediately following shows signs of dynastic instability, the loss of vassal territories, and military weakening that contributed to the decline of Egyptian power in the Levant region. The system that had appeared eternal revealed itself fragile before something it could not control: tax, enslave, or worship. And here lies the deepest irony of this entire story. Egypt was the civilization that had mastered death better than any other. Its temples were houses of eternity. Its tombs were machines of immortality. Its pharaohs built pyramids of 2,300,000 stone blocks, each block weighing an average of 2.5 tons, the weight of 2 modern compact cars, to ensure they would never be forgotten. The whole of Egyptian culture revolved around the certainty that death could be defeated through human engineering, the correct ritual, the sufficiently large stone. And it was death itself that defeated them, not the slow death of disease or old age for which they had rituals, not death in battle, for which they had honors, the sudden, inexplicable, simultaneous death that no amulet stopped, no priest foresaw, and no physician treated. The death that entered every house as though the walls did not exist. The death that ignored social standing, wealth, military power, and theological sophistication. The people who walked out of Egypt that night carried 430 years of collective memory within a foreign land. Exodus chapter 12, verse 40. 430 years, longer than Brazil has existed as a nation, longer than the span separating the present era from the discovery of the Americas. Entire generations had been born, had lived, and had died without ever setting foot outside Egypt. The land promised to Abraham was, for most of them, simply a story told by grandparents. A place they had never seen, in a direction they did not know. Promised by a God many of them barely remembered. And still they went, barefoot, wounded, carrying children in their arms and gold in their sacks, with unleavened dough wrapped in their cloaks because there had been no time to prepare proper provisions. That multitude walked into the desert, not toward a prepared city, not toward built houses, toward emptiness, toward the sand, toward the unknown. The Egypt left behind was never the same. The marks of the 10 plagues were pressed not only into the land, but into the collective memory of a civilization that had seen itself as the center of the universe. Egyptian records from the period are remarkably silent on these events. Pharaohs did not make a habit of documenting their defeats, but the silence in this case speaks as loudly as any inscription. The absence of records of a catastrophe of this magnitude among a people who documented everything, from commercial transactions to the annual flood level of the Nile, is itself an archaeological data point. The Ipuwer papyrus, found in the Museum of Leiden in the Netherlands, dated in disputed fashion, but possibly reflecting traditions from the 2nd millennium before the Common Era, describes the Nile transformed into blood, darkness covering the land, widespread death, and the flight of slaves carrying the riches of their masters. The similarities to the account in Exodus are striking, though academic debate over the papyrus's dating and interpretation remains open. What no one disputes is that something happened in ancient Egypt that left marks deep enough to be recorded from multiple perspectives. And the people who walked out of that empire that night carried with them more than gold and livestock. They carried a narrative that would be repeated each year, in each generation, at every table where unleavened bread was broken and bitter herbs were eaten. A narrative that survived every empire that came after, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, Roman, and that continues to be told more than 3,400 years later, on the same night of the calendar, with the same elements, around tables scattered across every continent on earth. Egypt built monuments of stone to last forever. The Hebrews built a story passed from parent to child. The monuments are in ruins. The story is still alive.